Hi Phil, it's nice
Hello.
getting to chat to you. I've not talked to you since the Gary Speedwalk when we sat on the side of the curb next to the mural and looked exhausted together. That was fun.
That seems like a long time ago. That was pretty much me out of gas at that point. The last 3 miles I thought were pretty hard. Everybody else seemed to be cruising through it because they knew they were home, but I think my feet had given up by that point. But at least we knew we were going to make it. That was the main thing.
That's true. My feet gave up the day before, which was always what you want to see, innit? Um, so I've just got a few questions. I'm going to start with the more general stuff.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
as an outsider looking in, like football journalism's really confusing. It's something I'm trying to get into myself. I've done a little bit of writing recently, which I'll get into in a minute. But what does a day in the life of Phil Hay actually look like? Like on a non-match day sort of time.
I know what you mean. I think these days journalism as a industry and as a profession is so much broader than it was when I first got into it. You tended to take your pick between written journalism, i.e., newspapers, because there was no other outlet for that, broadcast journalism, but split into two sides, radio and television, and that was it. And the radio was fairly broad in that you had local stations, you had national stations, likewise with television, but as a whole, it was quite narrow. There were lots of local newspapers, there were lots of national newspapers, but the sort of direction of travel, certainly for a writer like me, you perhaps work for an agency beforehand, then you go on to a local paper, and then the ambition would be to move to a national. These days, it's multimedia in the truest sense. So you have some journalists like me who purely write online. You still have journalists who write for newspapers. You have some who run independent blogs, and I think that's been the big impact of the internet. Is that you're not restricted now in being able to write about football, because if you can get access to a web page, which most people can, and it's not particularly expensive, then you have an outlet to write. And likewise, you have people who work in audio but purely do podcasts, so never go near a radio station. And it is, it's incredibly wide reaching. And I can understand now why people would look at it and think it's kind of hard to understand what it is that you do. I mean, for example, I obviously write the articles that go up on the Athletics website, but they're not daily. We tend to do, well, on average, about three a week, and they're longer than the pieces that I would have written in the Evening Post, which is why we don't publish so many of them. We take a bit more time on them and try to make them more detailed. But of course, because it's a website, you have the luxury of doing that. With the newspaper, you still have deadlines, you still have targets online for hits and everything else. So, in a lot of respects, different jobs require different things of you and make different demands of you. Typical day will depend on where I am in the working week. If I have an article that needs written for the following day, we have a 2 p.m. deadline for the following day's copy. So my morning and early afternoon will be spent writing that, making sure it's finished and in on time. The days leading up to it will be spent gathering the content that you need for the article. So speaking to people who you need to tell you about certain issues in it, who need to explain certain things in it to give you some insight, either on the record where they'll be quoted or off the record where they won't be. Um, and then you have to plan ahead. So I have various pieces in the background which I've been working on for a couple of weeks. Some of which probably won't run yet for another couple of weeks yet, possibly towards the end of the month, possibly next month, or potentially holding them for the duration of the World Cup, where there is not going to be an awful lot going on at football clubs. Leeds might
Yeah.
well do a little tour in that time. They have talked about going to the States for a training camp, but there will be no game for most of August and December, and there'll be no transfer window either. So it will be sparse. So it's a balance for me. It's a balance between making sure that you have enough um, content, enough articles immediately to kind of fill the quota through the week to keep the website ticking over through the week, but also that you've got your bigger reads and longer term plans going on in the background. And then, of course, from time to time, like this morning, I'll factor in podcasts. We recorded my podcast at 9:30 first thing, and we have two a week. So those fall into the diary as well. Match day, as it happens, I mean, is far easier to explain. And I would imagine for people looking in, following Twitter and everything else, is far easier to understand as well. But through the week, that's generally how it works.
Yeah. So is match day more a matter of rock up at the ground, write some preamble for whatever you think will come about, write a match report as you go, and sort of press conference bits as well, I assume?
Yeah, it's slightly different at the Athletic because the plan at the outset was to make match pieces different. So rather than going and just writing about broadly what you see um, as a whole, you were trying to focus in on specific issues or specific players or slightly more off the wall stuff to take a bit of a different look at individual games, which I think is definitely easier to do in the early part of the season where there's not necessarily a huge amount riding on each individual game week to week. I think when you have a season like last season, and this was also for Leeds United anyway, and this was also true of the promotion season from the Championship, there comes a point in it where the only show in town is either the threat of relegation or the promise of promotion, and it becomes far more difficult to kind of divert your attention away from that because you know that that's what your readers are thinking about. It's what they're talking about. It's ultimately what they want to read about as well. Match days, certainly for a 3 o'clock kickoff on a Saturday, I tend to get there for about midday, which is probably ridiculously early, but I like watching the early games before the game kicks off. And then you have team news, which always comes an hour before the game. So 2 o'clock for a 3 o'clock game. And then the game will finish around about 4:45. You have your press conference duties straight after. And I tend to type on the evening of the game. So we'll finish up at anything between kind of 8 o'clock at night or 10, 11 o'clock at night if it's a more complicated piece or if you need to speak to people about certain things that have gone on. But I think from following Twitter and seeing obviously the pre-match tweets, the tweets during the game, the post-match tweets about the press conference and other things that have arisen, you can probably see the structure of that better than you would the average day. When as in general, my core hours are kind of 9 to 5, but it's not a 9 to 5 job, and there are an awful lot of days where you find yourself either starting earlier or finishing much later, just because of the things that go on.
Yeah. On the topic of it not being a 9 to 5 job, there was a certain day of the year that I'm a little bit curious about. I'm just going to quickly fix something with Google Meet. Hold
Yeah,
on.
sure, sure,
It's
no problem.
gone janky. There we go. That'll do. Um, so you mentioned how it's like mostly a 9 to 5 ish kind of job most of the time. I'm guessing deadline day and transfer windows are very different. Like this year, this last summer, um, I was doing writing for the website that I work with a little bit, and trying to keep track of everything was absolute madness. And that was from an outside perspective without having 1,000 different sources saying 1,000 different things. So how does that sort of add up on your end?
Well, deadline day was a great example of that because I got up at about 6:30 and had messages about Cody Gakpo at PSV. The fact that PSV had said no to that, and to Leeds offer for him. I was in touch with David Ornstein at our place, who is very, very well connected, and also had the same message. So we ran a story on Gakpo to Leeds not happening around about 7 o'clock in the morning, just after I think, and business was wound up at about 10 past 12 at night, 10 past midnight, when Leeds announced that they'd signed Wilfred Nonto from FC Zurich. We had to re-record our podcast after that because, maybe slightly rashly, and we did joke about this as we were doing it, we recorded it during the day when it looked like Bamba Dieng was coming in from Marseille. We had this nice podcast all kind of wrapped up and ready to go as soon as the deadline passed. And then, of course, Dieng didn't arrive. He failed his medical at Nice. The whole thing was a mess. So we sort of sliced and diced the podcast, re-recorded a big section for it at about 12:30 at night, and I finished up about 2 in the morning. So that's almost a 24-hour day. Um, Obviously, you don't have too many like that. I mean, it does happen, quite regularly that you find yourself working really late or your hours extend. But it's not often that you feel as if you've gone from the earliest hours in the morning to the latest at night. I think other the other example of that jumps out would be Mad Friday with Chilino and Brian McDermott, because I think what's often forgotten on that day, everybody remembers the carnage late on when McDermott was sacked, and it was just chaos down at Ellen Road. But actually, the day began with the process of GFH being about to sell the club to Chilino. So again, I think my first phone call that morning was about 6 o'clock from somebody at the club. And there were quite a few people in the club who, while they didn't like GFH, were worried about Chilino and what he was going to mean for them, as a new owner, understandably. So about 6 o'clock, I had a phone call from somebody saying, "Look, I think they're going to sell to this guy today. I think they are going to get this done." So, and we knew that would have implications for McDermott, who held a press conference later in the day. But that was another occasion where an awful lot of stuff that was written for the paper at, say, 5 o'clock in the evening had to be completely shredded and written again because we went from GFH agreeing to sell to Chileno to McDermott's press conference to McDermott then being sacked and various other people being relieved of their duties and a couple of sponsors threatening to pull out because of what had happened. That I think was another night where I finished at about 2 in the morning. And I think that by a mile has been, with the exception possibly of the administration story in 2007, the summer when Leeds went into insolvency, that would be the most complicated story I've ever had to cover in terms of the speed at which it was changing and the amount that it was changing.
Yeah, I was about to further down in my questions. I've got, are there any stories that you've had to scrap at the last minute? But I'm assuming Bamba Dieng is an entire podcast gone. All of the Chileno coming in stuff is several articles in the bin, or is
Well,
it a matter
yeah,
of
no,
yeah?
it happens. It happens enough for you to remember them. I mean, Cuisance from Bayern Munich was another one in the summer of 2020. He was here for a medical. To all intents and purposes, it was done with the exception of the medical. And we'd done a long read about him on the Athletic, which we were able to salvage because in the end it became a piece of about where is this guy going? He's seen as a very talented footballer. People in France who know him speak really highly of him and think he's got vast potential. But it hasn't worked out for him at Bayern Munich. He isn't going to be signing for Leeds because of this issue with his medical, which he disputed, but Leeds were worried about an aspect of it concerning his foot, so didn't go ahead with it. That one we were able to save, but at the same time, completely different to how it would have been initially. It would have been a piece about this is who this new signing is, as opposed to where does he go from here. So yeah, it does happen, and part of the reason, I mean, equally good example would be Dan James, because that was different again in as much as he'd passed his medical and done absolutely everything. And in terms of being agreed with Swansea, or at least had been pretty much finalised with Swansea, and the fact that he was at Ellen Road and had done his signing photos and had done all the media commitments, which the club media commitments, which will be somewhere but have never ever seen the light of day, made you think, this is happening. So we had a big spread, 2-page piece written on it for the Evening Post, back page written for the Evening Post the following day. And that fell through at 11 o'clock at night, which meant that as time ticked on and it got towards 9:30, 10 o'clock, and we realized that there was a problem, or there was potentially going to be a problem, I had to write something completely different, something essentially timeless that didn't relate to James at all, because the paper was going to go to print, and there was a huge danger of it being out of date the moment it hit the press. As soon as it was printed, something would have happened with James that rendered all the copy redundant or just inaccurate. So we were able to do a back page about the Dan James deal is off at the last minute, a really short piece.
Yeah.
But that spread didn't appear in the paper. It did go online, but it went online about 2 or 3 hours later because there was so much detail in it and so much that needed to be rewritten that it needed the time to do that. And that has been, I suppose, the beauty of the internet is that you're no longer pinned down to your edition times with newspapers. You can publish things whenever you like, but it does mean that we're quite often working till all hours.
Okay. So in terms of transfers like that, I've got a specific example here. It's like presumably everyone knows something's happening in the club. Everyone knew that Dan James was there. Everyone knew that Brendan Aronson was coming. Weirdly, no one knew about Willie Gnonto. I was wondering if it's a case of the club using embargoes and stuff to sort of like keep the transfer release as and when, or is it a matter of journalists are just like 90% sure and then the official confirmation is a sort of okay, go. Fine.
It it varies. The Nonto one came out the blue. To the extent that none of us by that stage were or prior to deadline day were expecting it to happen in that window. The plan was for it to happen in January or later if they decided to leave him at Zurich for the full season. But a deal was in place with Zurich as it turned out. It was just that he wasn't due to come in this window, and it was a very late decision, around about 6 or 7 o'clock at night, where because they hadn't got Dieng, because they hadn't got Gakpo, because other players that they'd been thinking about weren't going to happen, they decided that they should bring the Nonto deal forward, pay Zurich a little bit of extra money, but they had a willing seller there, and it was easy to do, and it meant that there would be a striker in as opposed to nobody arriving, and it also meant that they could sanction the Dan James loan without it looking as if it had been one out and nobody in, which would have to use that phrase, the optics of that would have been very, very bad and very negative. Um, there are occasions, if a club are signing a player that nobody knows about, there are occasions where they will send you an embargoed press release, usually.
That would be that DPD delivery and the dog getting nuts. One second. Right, sorted.
So, yeah, you will have occasions where if a club are signing somebody that nobody knows about, or it same applies to the announcement of a new contract. If it hasn't been reported anywhere, they will send you an embargoed press release, which means that the news can only be released at a set time. And convention is that if they send you that and you don't know about it in advance, you wouldn't run it or publish anything until the embargo time, because they are effectively telling you and saying to you, leave it until this point to announce it. It's different if you know already, then
Yeah,
it's your information and you can do what you like. There are occasions where you are aware of a transfer that might well be happening, but you're not 100% convinced and you're not convinced enough to run it. But these days, it's pretty rare for journalists to sit on something and not do it until, not run anything until the club announces it. It's totally different if the club have managed to keep it under wraps. But these days, it's nigh on impossible to do that. I mean, Danny Ings from Southampton to Villa last summer is one of the few that has really appeared from nowhere. But actually, there were people at our place who thought that was happening
yeah.
before it did. Not me, I have to say. I didn't know anything about it, but there were people at our place who did actually think that Ings to Villa was on the way.
Hang on, he keeps losing his mind. I'll be one
That's
second.
right. Yeah, no problems.
Hello. Anyway, so I've forgotten where we were at. Danny Ings.
I was just saying that was one of the few kind of transfers recently that has just come completely out of the blue.
Yeah, and I'm assuming with the whole you don't break an embargo if the club's given you some information sort of thing. I'm guessing that's on the sort of punishment of, or you'll not get information in the future, and then you're pretty much knacked as.
Well, it's more the case that because it's their announcement, and this doesn't just apply to football. You would have had, for example, you have announcements from, say, Buckingham Palace, some from government, and so on, which are embargoed, and you do have to respect that in the sense that minus them sending you that information, you don't have it. It's very
Yeah,
different if you have the story and you have the information and you're going to them and they're saying, don't run this. That's entirely your prerogative to run it. And there are rare occasions where, because of circumstances or because of something that's going on, you will either hold the story for a little while or run it slightly later, but not to the extent where you do nothing with it until everybody else is running the same story as well. That kind of defeats the object of what you're doing. Um, so yeah, that's kind of how it works. And people might have seen recently, it's slightly different this, but Jesse Marsh asking in press conference what are embargoed quotes, because people have picked up on the fact in the televised in the live broadcasts of his press conferences that there comes a certain stage at which the media staff at Leeds will say this is the embargoed section, and a lot of people have asked me, is there any sort of great mystery to this or any mistake? And the honest answer is no. What it means is that the quotes and the questions and the answers before the embargoed stage are free to use immediately. So you can tweet them, you can run them on a blog, you can run them on a website, whatever you want, they're there to be used. The embargo section are held for a specific time. And the reason for that is that if you go to Thorpe Arch on a Friday, um, for a game on a Sunday, the national papers will want to run, and the local papers will want to run stories from the press conference on the Saturday in their
yeah,
editions. But they'll also want fresh quotes for the Sunday, on the day of the game, preview quotes. So essentially, the embargoed section gives them that. That's all that means, is that those quotes are held back until usually 10:30 on the night before the game, which means that you have a certain number of quotes that are used in Saturday edition, a certain number of quotes that are used in the Sunday edition, and they're all different. And therefore, on the Sunday, you get fresh stories.
that makes sense. Yeah. So aside from the club informing you of like random transfers that have popped out of absolutely nowhere, in terms of other transfers, like does that sort of you've occasionally spoken about like the word from the club being that there's a certain player like they're looking at or like Yeah. Aside from that, is it sort of agents reaching out to you? Is it you reaching out and asking questions? Is it?
It varies. You have people at a club, or you have agents, or you have other people you know in the game who you can go to and speak privately about stories that you've picked up or transfer rumors that you've picked up. Um, the stronger they are, the more people are likely to say, "Listen, you're along the right lines with that. We're not going to say anything on it. We're not going to say anything official, but we're not going to tell you that it's wrong because that wouldn't be true." Um, but also, it's useful if you think about the sheer number of players who are linked with Leeds in a transfer window. And I mean, it strays into the hundreds. It is, on occasions, it is relentless of Leeds linked with this player, Leeds interested in that player. It's what you need to have people say to you. There's no point getting involved in that story because we're not going to do it. We're not going to sign him. uh, Ismail Sarr down at Watford, right back end of the window, was being spoken about as if he had virtually signed for Leeds, as if it had been agreed. But then you speak to people who say, no, he won't be coming in. It's not somebody that we're going for. And what it does is it saves you getting sucked into story and writing endlessly about Sarr when it is never going to happen, and it's not. And that doesn't mean that you know everything that's going to happen, and you absolutely don't. There are people out there with plenty of contacts elsewhere that I don't have, particularly abroad. And these days, stories come from all sorts of places and all over Europe, mainly because Leeds are scouting all over Europe. But it is useful to be able to know the stories that you can swerve and ignore completely.
Because it just saves you a lot of time, and you can instead invest that time in. This is almost certain to happen. Go for it.
Yeah, and also we look at the Athletic that we have a lot of journalists who work for us, and a lot of them, have really good contacts, and a lot of club specific. So you can kind of pull contacts and pull information and lean on other people, elsewhere. If it's you've been linked with a player at a specific club that they cover, they will have ins, they'll have people they can speak to. Quite often with transfers, it's about the balance of probability. You have to listen to what's being said and kind of form a view on: is this likely? Is this serious? Is it worth writing about?
So, like the Aronson one, I'm assuming you basically knew was done whilst we were on the walk because you were saying it should be there in a day or so.
The Aronson one was strange actually because obviously Leeds had gone for him in January and it hadn't happened, but Salzburg had been quite open in saying to them, "We're not going to be obstructive about this in the summer. If you bid enough money, then we will sell him." And that story came to us as I was in the press room at Brentford after the last game of the season. We published that I think at about 7 o'clock at night, 7:30 at night. And what makes me laugh about that is that the window genuinely did run from absolutely the conclusion of last season to the very, very last minute of the deadline, which was Nonto. It was totally relentless. And okay, there was a period in which Leeds didn't sign anybody, from Sinistera onwards. Proven
Yeah,
first team players. There was nothing around, but it didn't mean that there was nothing going on in the background. There was still the stuff with De Ketelaar, and then at the last minute, it was Gakpo, it was Dieng, it was Nonto. All that happening. So it was a long window. It was a really long window. But yeah, and the other one on the walk that someone had told me about was Christensen that I ran on I think the Tuesday after that walk. Christensen from
yeah.
RB Salzburg. So quite often that is in the background, and when you do pick up on them, you kind of hoping that nobody else does before you get the chance to write about them. But then equally, there are people out there who write about things that you don't know, and pick up transfer stories and and bits and pieces that you're not aware of. And I have to say, there are some transfer experts out there like David Onstein and Fabrizio Romano who are just absolute machines when it comes to that stuff.
Like the entirety of the last hour of deadline day for me was I'd written a stub article for whoever was coming in at Leeds because it looked like someone was on Twitter and said like the boardroom when lights were on or something like that, and I was like, right, okay, I'll get something ready. And the entire time was just me watching a Twitch stream. Like, can I have a name, please? I want to go to bed now.
That's it. That's it. And it comes when it comes.
Yeah.
Nothing else you can do.
So, in terms of building up these contacts, is it just people that you've sort of bumped into around the club throughout your years? And
Yeah, absolutely. People you get to know. Same with agents and players. Ex-players move into certain jobs. Some move into media. Some players who've never played for Leeds that you get to know in other ways. That you've done pieces with for various reasons. You've crossed paths with them. You've stayed in touch. They're well connected. They pass bits and pieces on. That's pretty much how it works for all of us.
fair enough, yeah. In terms of more general stuff rather than transfer market bits and bobs, which I'm sure you get the most questions about of all of your work.
Without a doubt.
Um, So how do you find yourself reporting on Leeds rather than any other club? What sort of led you to the YEP first of all?
Um, I lived in Leeds after I went to Sheffield University, University of Sheffield, to do journalism, and moved through to Leeds straight after that. Essentially, because I was joining the Press Association, I was joining PA Sport, who were based right in the middle of Leeds, about a 5 minute walk from the station. So I moved into Garforth with my other half, who's now my wife, and then PA moved out to Howden towards Hull, which wasn't ideal. Um, but the big so I was at PA for 2.5 years straight after university, and the biggest issue for me at PA was the struggle to get out and actually report on live events. It was a challenge to find the for them to convince them to give me the time to go to games, to go to press conferences. It was very office based. It was office based. It was there were lots of aspects of it that were really good and really good for me,
Yeah,
but it was office based in a way that you could find yourself covering. For example, one of the clubs on my watch was Southend, and Southend were, a couple hundred miles south, where you never were. They didn't really know who you were, but you were trying to phone them up for interviews and everything else from time to time, and it could be a challenge. I'd always wanted to work on a local paper covering a big club, and the Evening Post and Leeds were ideal in that sense. That was exactly what it was that I was
yeah,
after. It was also perfect for me in terms of location because of where we were living and where I was based. Um, and what happened was that I'd applied for a job at the Northern Echo, chief football writer's job there, and got down to the last two. And the job went to a good friend and colleague of mine, Scott Wilson, who is still up there. Scott was on the Evening Post as their kind of number two writer. General sports writer, but with a kind of firm focus on football, and covered for Leeds United when the chief football writer was away. He moved up to Darlington. I got offered the job at the Evening Post, and as I say, it was just ideal, and it kind of opened the door to much more sort of day to day reporting that you could actually get your teeth into and get your claws into, and from there, it just kind of organic, really. The chief football writer who was there at the time, Paul Dews, he went to work for Leeds as their media officer in 2006, just after Leeds lost the playoff final. I got the chief football writer's job in that summer. I still don't know whether I was really qualified for it at that point or really ready for it at that point. It was a massive, massive challenge adapting to it and getting used to the pressure of it, and everything else took a long, long time. And as time went on, I just sort of became part of the furniture. Really, I liked writing about Leeds. I liked Leeds as a club. I liked the fact that there was always something going on there. There was always something to write about, always something to think about, always something to ask about. And I guess the payoff for the meandering years of the Bates era and the chaos of GFH, Chileno, the spells where you thought it was never going to happen. The constant conversation about Leeds are a huge club and it's inevitable that one day they're going to be back in the Premier League. Plenty of years where you thought there's nothing to say that's actually true, because if they don't get an ownership model that works at some stage, it's never going to happen. And for so long they were miles off it. And I think, as I say, the big payoff for all that was the Bielsa era, which was just at its height and at its best was just absolutely sensational in so many ways.
yeah. I was relatively lucky because as a teenager, I was one of those that wasn't really into football, and then in my uni years, I sort of got back into it, and that was in the Christensen point. I think my
Mhm.
first match back was that horrible FA Cup defeat that no one could really understand. Um, and then I just sort of had decent times since that, so I'm okay
Yeah,
with it. Yeah.
yeah, good man.
So how did you make the jump from writing articles to writing a book? Because it's quite a lot bigger.
Um, I've done two, um, one of which I'm prouder of than the other. The thing about the Bielsa book was that it was a proper project. So it wasn't that the initial one wasn't done by an established publisher. It was just very last minute, and it was all a little bit throwaway. And I have to be honest, I don't think the attention to detail in it from my end, but I worked as hard as I could on it, but it was in amongst a time when Leeds were going for promotion from League One. It was incredibly busy. I was given a really short turnaround time to do it, and an incredibly short deadline as well, which made, tight deadline, which made it very, very tricky. Um, and also, I was a pretty inexperienced writer at that stage. When I look back, I'm not sure I was in a position where you would necessarily have come to me and said, "You're ready to write a book." Whereas with the Bielsa book, it was different because of the I guess the benefit with that was that because I'd written about him from the start of his time at Leeds, I'd already done a lot of the research for it. I'd already done a lot of looking into who he was, what he did. And at The Athletic, because we were trying to write a bit more in depth, you were looking around constantly for stories around him. You were finding out new things all the time. And the publishers who did that, Orion, or it was a branch of Orion, Seven Dials Books, were extremely professional and very diligent, great at planning it, great at publicizing it, great at keeping in touch with you, following your progress, but not putting ridiculous pressure on you. I mean, I had the bonkers thing with them of dropping them an email kind of mid-February, about 2 3 months before the book was supposed to be finished, to go to print, to say, listen, the end of April, I'm going into hospital to have a brain tumor removed. Which is about the worst thing you can be told if you're a publisher who's expecting a book to arrive. And the way it had been structured meant that we were able to finish most of it before that point, and it didn't leave much to be done afterwards. But writing a book is, I think The Athletic sets you up quite nicely for it because you get used to writing at length.
Yeah.
And you get used to having to piece together fairly complex articles, or articles that have a lot in them, and need a bit of thought and need a little bit of planning. But to go, to writing a book, which in the end, the paperback with the epilogue is around about 90 to 95,000 words long, is different. And you asked how you go from it and how you can do it. You don't really until you get into it and get cracking.
I was in a slightly weird position at that point because my fiance was working as an intern at Orion. So so like coming off a meeting at one point, she was like, "Have you heard that Phil Hay's doing a book?" And I was like, "I hadn't, but I guess I have now." And there were a few times where I was like, "Are you sure you couldn't like work on that and get like a copy of the manuscript or something?" But no luck.
The thing about that is that that's actually quite a good example of the way that journalism works these days, because one of the really good resources for journalists, and I guess this has always been true, for football writers, but it's more so now because people can contact you via Twitter, people can contact you via email. It's far easier to get in touch with you. One of the great resources is supporters. I was doing a training talk for some of the younger writers at the Athletic, and I was saying to them, you have to be kind of, I don't know if humble's the word, but you have to be kind of honest enough to accept that there are some supporters out there who know far more than you do about certain things, because they know the club's chief exec or the club's sporting director, or they're friends with a player, or friends with a player's brother, or their dad's an agent, and they hear things that they get told. And because they're supporters rather than journalists, people are more willing to tell them these things because they don't expect it to go anywhere else. Whereas if I phone up somebody asking about something, they know that I'm going to write about it or thinking about writing it. So you're naturally more guarded. And that's exactly it. You find out that I'm writing a book because your partner is an intern at Orion, in the same way as, supporters at Christensen coming to Leeds from Salzburg. That came from a fan who knew somebody at the club who told them
Hmm.
that it was going to happen. That's how it came to me. So yeah, it's interesting that, but I had no idea that that was the case.
Yeah.
She was right.
Yeah. She worked that one out. If I remember right, it was in a meeting where they were choosing covers or something, and I was like, "I know that name of Bielsa and Phil Hay. That's a bit weird." Yeah.
There is
Um.
another Phil. He writes films and in the States. So every now and again, I get tweets telling me how much they like a certain film or how much they hate a certain film, which is always quite amusing.
I imagine he gets the odd tweet on transfer deadline day as well, going, "What's going on? I don't."
Probably does. I don't think he's on Twitter, but I did get a long email from somebody once asking for advice about various things to do with filmmaking and this, that, and the other. And I thought, I did reply, but I thought, oh, bless, there's actually nothing I can do for you here. I can't even tell you where to forward this on to.
Yeah, the first step in writing a film is email the right person.
Yes, I would say so.
So what would you say from your time at The Athletic is the article that you've been proudest of doing? Is the one that stands out? Is it one that like took a lot of time and attention? Like, am I right in remembering that you went to Rosario at one point for an article?
No, the story with
Oh,
Rosario was that I was booked to fly to Buenos Aires in the week when the season shut down because of COVID.
oh, okay.
It was all arranged, and then the flight was cancelled the night before. But as it happens, I mean, I was due to go for 4 nights, so a night in Buenos Aires to meet various people there, and then up to Rosario. But it was, I don't think even if the flight had been going, I'd have gone out there because there was at that point a massive risk that you were going to get stuck and you
Yeah,
weren't going to be able to get home, and everything just kind of ground to a halt. Um, there've been a few. I really enjoyed the Bielsa big read that we did after promotion. There was loads in that, and it was great just putting the whole tale together about what had happened. And how it had all gone and what the process of hiring him had been, and then what it was specifically that he had done, and other people at the club had done to make it work. It was pretty fascinating to find all of that out. Some niche pieces as well. I did a piece with Alex Cairns, the ex Leeds academy goalkeeper who's over at Fleetwood. He lost his brother in a car accident. It was only in his teenage years, Blake, and I went to see him to talk about it on the anniversary of it. And it was, pieces like that are totally different to run of the mill football. And actually, it's nice as often as you can to kind of touch base with the real world again, because football can be a bit of a kind of fantasy land in a lot of respects, and a bit sort of fairy tale esque as opposed to what's really going on outside the front door. Um, and in that respect, I think the piece that I'm proudest of, and the piece that required most work, was the article, the feature we did on the 20th anniversary of the killings in Istanbul, which was, I mean, that was about 6 months of work, and it owed everything to people being willing to talk about it. Peter Ridsdale, um, to Josh Spate, who was the son of Kevin Spate, Chris Loftus, his brother Andy, spoke to us as well. Security guard Kevin Fellows, who was out there. Um, I don't know if I mentioned Peter Ridsdale there, but Peter as well took the time to speak about it. And the interesting thing with Peter is that his checkered reputation, at least to say the least, when it comes to the financial running of the club. But on that issue and on a really really important night, in Istanbul, did all the right things that should have been done. But that was tough to write, and it was stressful because you were. I say it's stressful. I mean, it's stressful from a journalistic point of view, which is not the same as what some of the other guys involved in this have been suffering from. But you're worried about the tone, and you're worried about it being written properly. You
yeah.
also have to try and be objective about what went on in Istanbul without being unfair. Um, the reality when it comes to it is that you weren't there. You didn't see any of it. You don't actually know 100% what happened, and there's still a lot of conflicting tales out there. But I was happy with the way it came together in the end, and it's my favourite piece, which is not probably the right way of putting it, but it would be the piece I'm most proud of.
It's I see how favorite doesn't quite feel like the right word, but perhaps one of the more rewarding ones that you've done is
I
a way
think
of
so. I,
putting it.
I think also it felt to me quite important to tell the story of that properly, because it it hasn't ever had, and perhaps nobody wants it to, but it hasn't ever had the same level of attention as, say, Hillsborough or the Bradford City fire. And those were on a totally different scale in terms of the number of victims, and I guess the extent of the effect, the number of people, the sheer number of people that it affected, particularly Hillsborough. But with the Istanbul killings, neither of the families believe that they've had anything like proper justice. The Loftus family fought for it more than the Spates, and I think that was just because I guess there comes a point for certain people where you feel the need to move on, or you feel the need to let it go, and that's very much an individual thing, an individual decision, and that was totally up to them. That the Loftuses did fight for so long, but I think still feel that in Turkey they didn't take it seriously. Certainly speaking to Peter Ridsdale, absolutely no question that he thinks Galatasaray didn't take it seriously. He said to this day, I don't think they would accept that it was anything to do with them or they had any responsibility to deal with it in a certain way. Um, and that I think was quite apparent from the story. And, you know, it's I don't think it's the case that this has to be raised all the time and has to be spoken about all the time, but I think there should be awareness of it because it was an appalling event that had, really, really severe consequences for plenty of people. And sometimes it does feel a little bit like within football and outside of Leeds, it's forgotten slightly.
A slight tone shift. uh, But is there any advice that you'd offer someone that's just getting into football writing?
Um, yeah, I guess this is probably a society thing more than anything. Consider strongly getting a qualification, going to college or going to university, merely because there was a time when, and I mean, this basically happened to me at the Evening Post. The sports editor Phil Rostron, who sadly died not so long ago, but he was a great guy, was Phil. When I got the job at the Evening Post, we went over the road. The job interview was basically go over the road to TGI Fridays, talk about football and a bit about football betting, drink loads of Stella, and then at the end of it, he said, "Right, start on March the 13th." That was it. Doesn't really happen these days. I mean, a lot of us were headhunted for the Athletic, but it's kind of quite rare. A lot of employers, not just in journalism but generally, will run recruitment schemes through recruitment agencies or HR agencies where it is about the things you say, the things you do, the things you tick boxes for, the qualifications you have. And I think these days it's probably advantageous if you can afford to do it and you have the time to do it to get yourself a proper journalism qualification, really to help yourself through the door. In terms of football writing, firstly, write as much as you can, do as much work experience as you can, any opportunities you have to just see how it works and see what goes on, take it. And I always say to people, read as much sports journalism as you can across a variety of newspapers, websites, whatever it is, books. What will happen is you'll start to pick up on the way that other journalists write, the way that other football writers put the pieces together. You'll see things that you like that you want to either copy or adapt for your own stuff. You'll see things that you don't like and will want to avoid. And over time, it helps you to develop your own style, which you definitely need. But also, be patient. Be patient. I mean, I've been at this for like 20 years now, and you can see it in the bald head and looking worse for wear. But it's not, you cannot jump into this and expect to be going to write about the Champions League final. If you're lucky, that'll happen, But you have to graft like everything else, and you have to be prepared to wait for doors to open.
Takes time to build towards, but you get there.
Yeah, you do if you
Yeah.
stick with it. Yeah, absolutely.
These are less journalism-y based, but they still are a little bit. Um, so, what, in terms of Twitter, which is a very big question, what do you think Twitter's done for football journalism on the whole?
Um, Pros and cons really. It's given you a much broader perspective of the world of football as opposed to football that you see in front of your own eyes or outside your front door. We were talking about this on my podcast this morning about the fact that even with recruitment in football, if you go back to the 1990s, a lot of squads in England were domestic, a lot of domestic players. Whereas now recruitment goes everywhere in the world. Clubs in Europe and in the UK recruit or scout very, very heavily in South America, all across the continent of Europe, various markets that they keep a really close eye on. And the same's kind of true for journalism. You start to pick up stories and you start to read things about places and players and clubs and so on that you've either know very little or nothing about, but they're quite enlightening. It also gives you access to contact easily journalists abroad. If you've been linked with Cody Gakpo, for example, it takes you no time at all to find a journalist in Holland who can help you. It gives you the ability to approach far more easily official staff, players, ex-managers, current managers, coaches, all of that. A lot of them are on there, and you can contact via direct message or whatever else. I think that the downside when it comes to covering a club is the amount, and also I should say as well, if somebody else breaks a story about Leeds, you see it, it comes up very quickly, gets copied onto your timeline. So it's that in that sense, it's easy to keep tabs on what else is out there. The downside is the stuff that isn't true, or the stuff that's just a bit, articles that are just a bit of a flyer, which means that, as I say, if you have a summer of Leeds being linked with 150 players, it's absolutely inconceivable that they're going to sign 150 players. And on that basis, it's inconceivable that most of them are actually legitimate targets. In the end, it was kind of like, five, six first team, established first team
Yeah.
pros for Leeds out of that massive list. So it does mean you have to be more careful about separating, I guess, the wheat from the chaff. But it's not as if pre-Twitter you didn't get tip-offs that were wrong either. It's just done in a different way now, and more prevalent.
Staying in the digital domain, how have you found having a podcast and working with the Square Ball? How's that sort of? Has it given you opportunities that you didn't have before? Or is it just another route to sort of say the same things but in a bit more depth?
You definitely a bit more depth. I think the nice thing about it is that it lets you engage with people in a different way. So there are people out there who do not want to read football articles, don't want to read long football articles, but will happily sit and listen to people talking about it. There are people who like both, but it means that you can sort of engage with both sets. The Square Ball lads, despite appearances, and they won't make me saying that, are incredibly professional. Have an unbelievably professional setup in the studio, so they've been great to work with and really good at helping to build the audience figures, and to come up with ideas and to structure the show and everything else. Put it this way, I would miss it if we didn't have it. It's the writing is what I enjoy most of all. But it's quite nice to just be able to sit and chew the fat once or twice a week.
Having had a chat with Michael at about 10 p.m. last night in a last-minute, hastily arranged call, um, I think he'd disagree with you on the professional thing because I think he used the terms "it's all improv and Google."
it's it's all about the image you portray,
Oh
isn't it?
yes.
They have a really good laugh with it, and they're able to be far more irreverent on their shows than I am on the Athletic. But the production of it, I mean, Dan Moylan, who runs it, was formerly a radio DJ. So has that professional background, and it really shows in the production of it, 100%. So I think he's doing them down there a little bit.
On the
Although I,
subject.
I will
Oh,
say his electrics are very amateur.
oh yeah. On the subject of the Square Ball and stuff that they do, the Gary Speedwalk.
Yes,
Are you recovered? Are we?
I 99% yes. I think the second toe on my right foot is broken and permanently broken. There is a bone sticking out of it in a direction that it shouldn't be sticking out. But I don't think it's not particularly painful. And I don't think if I went to hospital and showed them it, they would do anything other than say, listen, that can't really be fixed. Just get on with it. So that's all right.
That's good.
Um, it's probably the only, with the exception of when I did the Three Peaks, um, with the Leeds United Foundation, it's probably the only thing I've ever done where at the end of it, I did genuinely wonder if parts of my body were going to heal, particularly the skin right under my toes, which was just red raw and blistered all over the place, and massive bits of skin hanging off, and it was basically basins of TCP for about 3 or 4 days that made that heal up properly. Um, I said this to the Square Ball lads that I hated the walk and loved it in equal measure. Um, Parts of it were absolutely brutal, and 27 miles a day, as it was for the first 2 days, as you'll know, such a long distance. I mean, I reckon 20 is about as far as you can push yourself without having to go to a well, which is basically empty. The last 7 miles of both were just so hard, and you felt like you had nothing left. But the people on the walk were great. It was lovely to mix with them, and it was a great achievement to finish it. And also, it raised a lot of money for two really important charities, particularly Andy's Man Club, that I've written a little bit about recently, and honestly do some great work. And I think if football, Premier League, EFL, whoever else are looking for charities to link up with and fund, or to help, that's one that they should be thinking about, because it does seem to me to be reaching quite far into football's core support.
What would you call your like best and worst bits? Because I think me and Michael agreed yesterday that the Tempest Club in Drago was one of the better bits because that was where you could see that we were almost there In terms of worst bits for me, I think I'd go with not being able to do day three because my knee just went, no, not today.
Ooh, best bit was the pub in Huddersfield on the Saturday night with one day to go. You kind of knew you were going to make it, and some people were drinking right the way through the walk. I sort of said to myself, I did have the odd pint day one, day two, but I did say to myself, I'll save myself for Saturday night so that that doesn't contribute to me just hitting a brick wall and not being able to go any further. I think the worst point would have been the arrival at Oldham Travel Lodge to find that the Premier Inn elsewhere had messed up booking and none of us could get into the rooms for 2 hours, which wasn't the fault of anybody organising it. It was the Premier Inn, to quote Normanton, being absolute dicks, really. I think he was gonna. I think he was gonna do a TripAdvisor review to that effect, which would have been totally fair, or at least at the time seemed like it would have been totally fair. Um, but even that, I think for me, the most pressurized point was the start of day two when we were all stood outside the Travel Lodge in Warrington, and your feet were completely destroyed. Whereas you'd got to the Gary Speed Memorial to start, and you'd been booted up and kitted out and everything else, and good to go. The following morning, your feet were in agony, your legs were really sore, and there was that horrible thought of we've got 27 miles to go today, and I honestly don't know whether or not my feet will be able to cope with this. You can get through the muscles in the hips and stuff, unless your knee goes in the way that yours does. You can get through that, but if your feet, if they blister to the point where you just can't walk on them, what are you going to do? So actually, getting to Oldham was a big relief because you did think, right, 2 days down, you've kind of started to condition yourself for the fact that your feet are so sore. But then sat outside the Travel Lodge drinking Strongbow, freezing cold. Yes, not great.
Um, the Huddersfield night, was that the Champions League match where we all found ourselves supporting Real Madrid?
Yeah, I didn't actually watch much of it. I think I was so tired by that point and so in need of just some bevy that we did kind of have eyes on it, but also it was massively delayed, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
I
was.
think
I can't remember what it was. The weird security things outside the ground, wasn't it?
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, there were all the security problems which are really bad beforehand. But which in the coverage at the time there wasn't a lot of talk about. So all you were aware of was that suddenly it was like 20 past 8 and there was nothing doing. So you're looking on Twitter and you're finding out what was happening. But I think it was a great night that because, as I say, everybody kind of realised that we were probably going to get there, and also that we were just about finished. And it was it was really sad finishing up because in the end it had been quite an adventure. I just don't think any of us could have gone any further.
On the subject of going any further, are you doing the next one? Normanton's planned about 106 miles this time.
I absolutely refuse to go on any more of Normanton's walks, mainly because this walk seemed to be like a tour of Chernobyl initially, and we got about I'd say about 4 hours of pleasant walking through the Pennines, which was lovely on day three. It was so nice in the sun. But no, when I came home, my wife said to me, "You're never going on this game because you're just moaning about your feet and everything else." I'd actually said to the square ball lads, "Listen, if Leeds get relegated, I probably can't go on this because I can't be away for 4 days when there could be all sorts going on. Who knows what the consequences of going down are going to be." Um, so when they stayed up, that was me. That was me committed. I would never say never because I did really enjoy it and I did really enjoy the people. But it's one of those that if I could sidestep it, then I probably will.
Oh yes. If I remember right, yesterday he said something along the lines of he knew that we were going through industrial wastelands, so he's planned a little bit of a scenic route via Burnley and Blackburn this time, or something like that.
Aye, that sounds convincing.
Mm.
Yeah. Hmm.
The beautiful part of the land known as Burnley. Fantastic.
Yes. Be prepared is all I'm saying.
Will do. Yeah, that's all the questions I've got, so I'm going to
Marvelous.
stop the recording there. Cheers, Phil.
No worries. No worries.